Yeah, well, from my understanding, it's also a much more systemically oriented, because you take in the context, the field much more. Indirectly, Erickson did that also, I guess.
Completely.
But in the way it was perceived, and maybe also he described it sometimes in himself, but more in the way other people made then descriptions about him, I really had this feeling there's something missing. No, my roots have been in how I came to Erickson, have been the systemic field anyway. So at that time, maybe that has also influenced very much my development, because at first in the systemic approach, and I think even today it's very often so in the mainstream, that it's very much cognitively oriented. And this cognitive orientation is very helpful, but it's not enough. And I always had this feeling. I also had psychodrama trainings a lot, and worked with psychodrama groups where I made very good experiences also in Hakomi and other in body therapy things and things like that, in bioenergetics. And so I had this feeling. It's as if we, with this context, in a sense, we even support dissociation between different levels of experience when we only work this way. If we wouldn't work this way, it would be also not enough, because circular questions, for example, in systemic way, have been, if you use it in a certain way, like I like to use it, it's very helpful to. When people come sometimes in a symptomatic state, they intuitively, they feel they experience something, but they cannot connect it to the voluntary connect. They cannot make a kind of understanding, a context-related understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could say that even more generally about trance in itself. People go into trance, so I felt something great, but it's hard for me to move it into my ordinary life because I don't really understand it. It was an interesting experience, and then trance becomes almost like a ghetto, a place where you go on vacation.
Exactly, and then in a sense you are a little bit trance addicted, so to speak. Exactly. When you are not coping just like you want in the usual world. So, I go into my inner retreat, or so to speak, whatever you go, like in a sense as a fugitive or something. But then you have a protected field, wonderful inside. But then you go to the wilderness again, to the outside. Oh God, this shitty place. And this is not what was my interest. My interest was to make the transfer of these wonderful experiences into the usual world. So, and that was also this kind of systemic work very helpful to me, because I realized, with this part of the work, I can help people that they can reintegrate and get also a cognitive understanding that their intuitive reactions, even symptomatic ones, have been not a deficit or silly or something, but it was disconnected from the context in which it was, and that was a recontextualization work, a very important work. But on the other side, only that. Without the experience, without acknowledging all the sensory levels of body reactions and muscle reactions, emotions and things like that, that was also not enough. And so for me, it was very helpful what I learned with Erickson, but also very helpful to bring it in a more transparent way. For example, But
this thing we're talking about the integration of the inner and the outer worlds, for just for simplistic terms, I think that
in the inner, go on.
I mean, the inner world's got all the sensory experience and the experience in the body and so forth, and the outer world's got all these systems and these social patterns and institutions and ego identities. I think that it was there in Erickson, but it was not fully integrated. Mm-hmm. So that you had people like Haley primarily talking about that he said what the interpretation was to Freud, the directive is to Erickson. That what Erickson's main thing was saying to clients, go out into the world and do something different. Create a different world out there whereas, so that's really that outer focus. And I think that's a little more dominant in the earlier Erickson. And then you have Ernie Rossi saying it's all about this permissive suggestions to go inside and to find that. So I think that those differences between Erickson and Rossi in some way represent that it wasn't fully integrated in Erickson. And I just think, I just want to say, you know, I think that your work has been perhaps the most advanced or important in terms of really integrating those. And,
that's what I try.
And I think it's influenced me, and also what influenced me, you know, I usually get there like most people. I get there because I suffer too much from not getting there. And I think living too much in the inner world created significant amounts of suffering in certain parts of my life. And certain relationships failed because I was not fully present in them and able to really negotiate in terms of just, you know, more of the specific sorts of things. And so it slowly moved me, but at some point I think I really realized it's really, you have to have one foot into both worlds. And that's where your full humanness comes.
So it's a kind of a borderline competence you need.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
On both sides of the world. So
yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
But also I realized that was not convincing to me. Right in the beginning, yeah, but then I thought something is not fitting to me. I always heard by Milton himself, also by other people, trust your unconscious mind, and so. And then I learned about, you have to put also, or you have to offer amnesia. I said, why should I offer amnesia? Well, you see, if you don't have amnesia after the trance, this usual rigid conscious mind is very disturbing the whole process and brings a lot of problems into the process, as if that would be a kind of an antagonist force. And if the conscious mind is included, then it will inhibit the whole wonderful creative process. But that was not my experience.
Nor is it, I mean, if you do any modeling or interviews of really creative people, that you don't see that. You see really creative people are really able to live in the both worlds. And so they're showing a version of the conscious mind that's not trying to control or dominate or is insensitive, but I think really creative people are showing this beautiful, harmonious conversation. And I have to say, I mean, I think ultimately that's where one of Erickson's limitations was. You know, I say this with great respect. I think most of us would agree that a big piece of how he developed his extraordinary way was through the difficulties that he encountered, including his paralysis. So we say that the conscious mind, for most people, is almost entirely based on muscular contraction. We say, let me think. And Milton had no connection to his voluntary muscles. And so I think what we call the unconscious was pretty much his conscious mind. But because of that, his conscious mind was a little strange. It was so eccentric. And it worked so well in psychotherapy that, you know, we would all sort of smile at some of these strange explanations. But it may have been, I think, and again, I say this with, you know, continued reverence for him, that it ultimately was a limitation. His conscious mind was limited in terms of what the possibilities are. When he could engage with a client, I think that there was something that happens for a number of us as therapists. We can have this connection. The client in some ways completes us. So that we're able to do our best because the client is a part of our system. But if we then ask ourselves to do the same just with ourselves, psychotherapy is filled of examples of therapists who are brilliant and sensitive with their clients, not really able to do it with themselves.
Yeah, but I also had this experience when I do, and even I think he was in himself contradictory, because trust your unconscious mind, and when I asked him, how do you then explain, you always say there's all these possibilities, these confidences, these potentials in the unconscious mind, but if they would use the people would use them, they would solve their problems.
Yeah, why are they in your office?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then he said, well, that's because of the rigidness of the conscious mind, of the and that's inhibiting. But when I did self-hypnosis, for example, it's very clear, consciously I wanted to develop some kind of state, and with help of my conscious mind I developed it. Very helpful. So it was not inhibiting that, it was supporting that in a sense. That was also, and even himself, I was very ashamed once when I said there, and we started very early, not very late in the morning, I think sometimes at 12 o'clock or something, and I said, listen, I'm coming here thousands of miles, I fly to Phoenix, Arizona, I want to start at 9 o'clock because I want to learn more. And he said, well, but I don't start earlier. So I said, well, we have to discuss that. I came from the German student movement. I said,
yeah, the baton goes out, come on, Erickson.
Exactly. And the people, the Americans have been very, oh God, what does he do? And I was well, this is an authority, we have to question that. And we have to say, well, I don't see any reason because we should start at 12 o'clock. And he said, well, but I will start at 12 o'clock. I said, no, we have to discuss it and then we have to make a vote. I said, so, and he said, well, you can make a vote or not. I start at 12. So I said, why? That is not convincing to me. And then I said, well, I can tell you, when I get up in the morning, I'm full of pain, every morning, obviously. And I need very long time to be in a self-hypnotic state where I reoriented myself, and then I want to have breakfast and so I had to go much too early, I had to get up, and so I don't want that. I was so ashamed because I didn't know that, I didn't feel that, because when I experienced him, when he came in, he was present, he was the pure power in presence, so to speak. I never would have had the idea that he had pain at all, but then I thought, well, but how can he say the conscious mind and so on is always inhibiting? Because when he gets up and he makes self-hypnotic things for himself, he does it voluntarily. In a conscious level he starts, and that is helpful. So there's a contradiction in itself from my understanding. So that was also something which brought me to another approach.
I think, again, ultimately, I mean, I knew, so one of the things that was confusing to me, because he was God to me, and he could do everything and anything. Sometimes after the sessions, he would invite me, anybody else was there also, into his home, which is right next door, and he would start to show me photographs. And
the ironwood things.
And the ironwood carvings. But it was very confusing because he sounded like an old man who was forgetful. And I thought, is this just like a technique or whatever? But I don't feel any of that magic that I felt in the office. And I think, as I said, I know that he had to spend 2 to 4 hours in the morning to just do self-hypnosis, and then sometimes, halfway through the day, said, I need to take a break. It wasn't to eat, it was to go do pain control. So I think his ordinary conscious state was often very pained and very limited. And I don't know this for sure, but I'm just speculating that he found in trance this way to release from all those limitations.
I can understand.
And
I guess you're right.
And that for most people, they have a better possibility for having the intact conscious mind that's not racked with pain and years of paralysis, so that they can form what I think of as the, what I call the generative state. It's really a third self, just like a creative intimacy, creative mature intimacy with a partner. It's a third self, and each member of the team is fully recognized, and their participation is fully there. And when the going is good, it really gives rise to an emergent property that's more than the sum of the parts. And that's something that I think that we as Erickson students, I feel it as, in my own professional development, the sort of thing that I think we can still develop a lot more of.
Exactly. And my way how I tried and still try from these understandings and these experiences was, but what was making me uncomfortable was that when I worked indirectly in this way, like I modeled it from him, or so to speak, I had this feeling it's not an encounter on equally ranked level, so to speak. But with that, in a sense, I discounted. I didn't want it, but in the effect, I guess I discounted some parts of the person on the other side, because I didn't address in German we say allparteilich, partiality to every part, or so, to be connected to every part, and that was not enough when if I was indirect. So always to appreciate and to also, in a sense, in a ritualized communication way, appreciate that here is the authority for this life, namely at the client's place. It was for me much better than to make more transparent explanation of what I do and what I did. And my experience was then, when I did it, it made the work even more effective. It didn't prevent something or inhibit something, it made it more effective. And the people gave me feedback, they felt more appreciated as a dignified person on the other side compared to when I worked indirectly. So for me that was clear, more and more, the more I work the more it's even more my tendency to be transparent and explain everything, always connected with feedback questions to the person. How does it affect you? What is your involuntary process responding to that and so? Because then I more and more learned when I did it this way. I said, I can do everything. I can suggest to people, I can invite them, but knowing, putting up autopoietic theories for Maturana, Varela, and so, which I always understand in this way, and this is for me really convincing. The experience is developed inside on the autonomous level by the receiver of the messages. So in a sense, it's very secondary what I do. It's important, but it's in a sense secondary in this way that I have then to be very curious and ask about how is the autonomous response by the other person. And the more I do that, the more I get the impression this is what, for example, John Kabat-Zinn and so on make with the mindfulness approach. That develops just on its own when you do this way. You can offer whatever idea, offering different perspectives, different evaluations, different kind of conclusions whatsoever, different images about the person, but never as a knowledge, always as a hypothesis, and then immediately connecting then with feedback questions. If I offer you that or that or that, always multiple opportunities in a sense, what is the most fitting somatic marker reaction inside of you? And the people tell me in their feedback, that brings me into a kind of a very interested, curious, also dignifying relationship to my spontaneous intuitive processes. They make me much more mindful. and also in a sense much more, strengthening my self-esteem that there is a force inside of me. And this is exactly what Erickson always talked about, which much more than my cognitive level alone, but it's important, also gives me very important informations. And the two of us, so to speak, we then give you the answer.
Each has changed. Each is totally transformed. What we would call roughly the conscious mind, the unconscious, each is deeply changed.
And by this other interaction, it changes both things, and it's a third new kind of development.
Right. That's right.
And therefore,
I have to say, in fairness, I'm sure you would agree, one of Erickson's greatest skills was his capacity to get feedback. Mm-hmm. And while he didn't do it verbally, I think he was absolutely, I've never seen anybody as intuitively tuned to the most subtle feedback, and part of his greatest integrity was always adapting to, these very subtle messages.
Oh yeah.
But as I think we're in agreement that, and partly, it was the times. He was coming of age in the 1930s, the 1940s, and we're children of the 60s,
The zeitgeist, the so-called zeitgeist,
it's a
is
very
totally
different culture.
different.
Very different. And, back then the idea was the father knows best, or the power is in the expert. And, you would say you were the student demonstrator, flamethrower, that said, no, the authority. But it was such a radical shift in the 60s, this notion that the deepest power or authority is inside. And so I think the zeitgeist, as you say, has led us as a next generation to be able to focus on these things of, okay, what Erickson was able to do is to have this sense of, wow, there's this incredible creativity. There's a place that is deeper than problems and has beautiful creative brilliance that is part of each human being. Mm-hmm. And I think what we, you and I and others in our generation have this opportunity to do is talk about, it's not just a property of this nonverbal intelligence. It's really a property of every part of every person, and it's really the systemic balance between each of these different parts that allows the really sustainable, healthy, creative people and communities and so forth.